Welcome back to Psychology Applied to Work. This is Lecture 11, Interviewing. All right. Last lecture, Lecture 10, which was the start of Chapter 4, was psychological tests for work. Predominantly, these are geared towards selection of potential candidates for jobs. And we talked about how you go about making sure that those tests are valid, and that validity was, or a valid test is a test that actually measures the thing you intend to measure. And we talked about reliability, which is a reflection of how retest consistency, how much of that you have, as well as whether your distributions, if you give the test to a group of people and then another group of people and another group of people, if the groups are truly random, that you can maintain the same distributions, and just generally that you know that you're not like keying in on some highly variable aspect of a person, and you want your test to be both valid and reliability, and that validity was the most important thing because it's making sure the test is doing what you hope it's doing. And then we talked about different types of ways you go about testing, and then we talked about cognitive tests, and we talked about intelligence, and I maybe chased a couple squirrels. The lecture ran a little bit over intended time, so we'll see if I can make that up to you. Today's lecture is pretty straightforward, and I will try to avoid squirrels to try to get back some of your balance. And we talked about personalities, and we're going to talk more about personalities and individual differences in lecture 12, which is individual differences at work, and that one should be fun. And then we ended with some just general other tests. Today is interviewing. Something probably most of you have already done, and certainly something that almost all of you or every one of you will do, possibly several times in your life. And also it's likely that the majority of you, in one form or another, either as a hiring manager or as part of a panel, will be on both sides of the interviewing table, so to speak. So we will talk about unstructured interviews and structured interviews, and situational interviews, and other types of interviews. And then we'll talk about other ways in which you can do selection in addition to, or potentially in lieu of interviewing. And then we'll talk about how in most organizations, what that workflow looks like. What's the sequence of steps for selection that has interviewing, as a key part of those steps. And then we'll talk a little bit about just some practical advice about how to be as good of an interviewee as you can be. All right, interviewing. First of all, it is pretty much the number one thing that any hiring organization does. It's rare that you hear about job offers being made without an interview. It can happen. It happens when the person you're trying to hire is well known by the organization. Perhaps the person previously worked at the organization and left on good terms. Perhaps the person is well known within the industry. But there are times in which people short circuit the interview process. But when you don't have a high confidence in who your candidate is, the vast majority of organizations use the interview as sort of the central theme amongst other things in the workflow that we'll describe that they use to make selection. And you're trying to see beyond the resume. You're trying to see beyond what you can get in writing. You're hoping to see the person. It's very difficult to see the whole person because the interview process is artificial, and it is often contrived in a way that the candidate is nervous or even if the candidate is not at all nervous, the candidate is still putting their best face forward. So you're not seeing the whole person typically. You're seeing as the best person the person can present, and that makes for some interesting complexity in the dynamic of interviews. And all right, danger for chasing a squirrel here, so I'll watch my time. I don't know how many people I've interviewed in my life. It has been lots. I suspect it's in the hundreds. And it's the process. Interviewing kind of sucks because you know you're not getting to the heart of the person, and you know you're creating a filter that makes people who are more comfortable in an interview situation look better, and it's not fair, and it's not fair to either party, because you're not looking for somebody that I want to have somebody that does great in interviews so that all day long I can have them do interviews. That's not what they do. You're trying to hire somebody for a job, and you want them to be great at that job. And that job usually doesn't involve presenting a veneer of yourself under a high-pressure situation. Sometimes, like certain sales roles and certain maybe public relations roles, or other leadership roles where people might have to do media appearances or that sort of thing. There, the highly artificial nature of the interview can be apropos, but for jobs that don't involve that, they create an environment, they create a situation in which people behave abnormally, and it's a difficult process. That said, I do not have a suggestion for what to replace it with if you do not know the candidate, and as we'll talk about, there's an expectation that an interview is done, and so I think the interviews are with us for quite some time. Okay, so I talked about this a little bit, this whole thing about people are presenting their best, or at least they're trying to present their best face, and what the term for that, or one of the terms for that, is impression management. The interviewee is trying to make themselves look good, and so they can act very deliberately, and so that's at play in the mix. And part of the interview process as a hiring manager, or at least as the interviewers in the panel, is attempting to see past that, and also attempting to gauge like how much impression management is underway, because what you also don't want to do is hire somebody that presents a truly false face. You don't want somebody that dramatically exaggerates or mischaracterizes who they are, and so people know that interview situations are artificial. People know that the person being interviewed is typically doing their best, but people also know that the person can be nervous, and so all this is in people's minds as it's going on. Okay, and so like I said, this is expected. Interviews are expected, and it's generally expected by both parties. Again, unless the candidate is very well known. The other dynamic at play is often the candidate is interviewing you in a way. They're usually more limited, at least in like first round interviews. They're more limited to how many questions, and it's usually not structured for the candidate to ask questions. But at the same time, often a candidate isn't 100% sure that they want to come to work for you. Maybe they already have a really good job, and you're trying to recruit them to your organization, and they're not really sure. In which case, the interview might flip. And on a time standpoint, you may end up spending a lot more time answering the interviewee's question, and really that's more of a recruiting going on. That's where you want this person because they have the talent you need. And you don't need to be discriminatory within their characteristics and skills and experience, because you know what they are. In which case, then you might be the one doing the selling. So much so that you representing your organization, trying to bring in some really high talent, may be the one being interviewed informally throughout this whole process. So it's an interesting two-way dynamic sometimes. Other times you have somebody that's just, they're looking for that one good job, or that even their first job, or they're out of work and they're looking for a job. So there's power dynamics at play, at differing degrees of advantage based on the optionality of each party, if that makes sense. All right, so usually an interview happens after some kind of initial screening, and we'll go through the workflow a little bit, but people don't typally open up their door and say, come in and interview, unless they're in a situation where they can hire unskilled people and they're desperately needing to fill a lot of slots. Usually there's a lot of steps involved before you get to the interview, and we'll talk about those typical steps. An interview can be a single round with a single person. Come in, talk to the hiring manager, and leave with a job offer. Or you could end up coming in and talking to 4 people for an hour, and then 2 hours later be in front of 3 other people, and then in the afternoon be in front of 1 person, and then go home, and then 3 weeks later get called back to talk to 2 more people. It depends on the position. It depends on a lot of things, and I've been involved in all of that, from single interviews to multiple rounds. And sometimes multiple rounds are because you're looking for that one candidate, and maybe this is a absolute critical candidate to the success of whatever it is you're trying to do in that organization. Or it might be that you are trying to decide between like 2 awesome candidates, and so you do second round or even third rounds as sort of playoffs, elimination rounds. So a lot of ways in which interviews can unfold. And then, as I've mentioned, an interview in a panel is common. In fact, it's becoming more common. In fact, there's a number of corporations in America where they are a requirement. And another new dynamic, certainly accelerated by COVID, is the acceptability of virtual interviews. And just generally speaking, technology like Zoom or Microsoft Teams or just video conferencing has become an acceptable means to make selection, especially considering in the changes in the workplace that have happened, again accelerated with COVID, where remote work is becoming more acceptable. You might interview somebody, hire them, manage them, and maybe not ever shake their hand, depending on circumstances. So things definitely are changing in that regard. All right, so the first type of interview that we're going to talk about is sort of the way things used to be done. And you'll still find this happening in small companies, maybe to some extent startups, maybe to some extent private, family-run companies, where they don't feel maybe the regulatory burden, or they don't feel the need to develop the documentation trail to try to have a stronger defense in case they're ever sued for discrimination, or otherwise they're just a brand new company and they don't have any processes. So you will still see unstructured interviews, but if in a large mature organization, they're gone for the most part. So what an unstructured interview is it's an open-ended question and answer tone. It can take all sorts of forms. And I mean, by the definition of unstructured. And so an interesting psychological dynamic often happens with an unstructured interview, which is because the person doing the interviewing is the agent with the decision rights, so to speak, because the person doing the interviewing is defining the questions, and they're doing it by thinking about, hey, how do I figure out who this person is? What should I ask? And they've made up their minds and they ask the question. Well, they often just think, well, those are good questions because that's the kind of question, that's the stuff I want to know. And so there's this illusion of validity that, because you're picking these questions, because you're examining this person, and you know about people, and you know your organization, and you know what you need, and you know the kind of person you're looking for. You can really think that your method is great. The data would say that most people do not do valid interviews. Most people are so full of preconceived notions and biases based upon the kinds of people that they've worked with before, or the kind of people they like, or things that irritate them. Or the schools they think are really good. So we went to this college, and well, so did I. You must be a good person. And weird, meta in-group, out-group dynamics, and all sorts of stuff can make you really biased. So generally speaking, unstructured interviews are unwise. They are highly variable. They are not consistent. They are, as I said, full of biases. Another thing is just they're seldom complete. You have a sense of what kind of questions you want to ask, and you have a certain time limit usually imposed by your schedule, and you may not have covered all the actual important questions. And so in a mature organization, they're uncommon. The other side of this is it's generally a dumb idea, or at least it's ill-advised from a protecting your business and making sound business decisions standpoint, of asking different people different questions. And one of the reasons is if you ask 10 people that you interviewed all completely different questions, and then you hired somebody, you're giving a case, or at least you're strengthening the case of the people you didn't hire, that you maybe gave the person that you did hire softball questions, and you gave the people you didn't hire really difficult questions because you didn't like them. And maybe the allegation could be that you didn't like them because of a protected class issue that that can be a violation of federal law, and it can also put you at risk of civil liabilities, where your organization could get sued, and a judgment could be made against you for a lot of money, if it was proven, at least within the court process, that you were being discriminatory. So one of the ways in which you strengthen your defense is to act in a way that's more objectively documentable that you were being consistent with all of your candidates. So it's an important thing, especially for mature organizations that have a lot to lose. It's also, generally speaking, the right thing to do. That's not to say that if you're a brand new startup and you're looking for those right people, but you actually don't exactly know who those right people are, that it might be quite difficult to come up with a canned set of questions and a canned process that will work with everybody. So it isn't to say that an unstructured interview has no place, but it's, generally speaking, not valid, and that means the burden's on you for your uniqueness of your unstructured interview to make sure that it is valid if you can, and it also does not create the paper trail that you can use to defend yourself if somebody says they weren't hired by you because of a protected class discrimination that they might allege. Okay, so if a unstructured interview is generally a bad idea, well then wouldn't a structured interview be a good idea? Yeah, so structured interviews are the common type of interview, and we're going to talk about behavioral situation interviews next, and those are, at least at a high level, a part of the whole formal interviews. That there is a defined structure to the interview process. So the structured interview is where you have predetermined questions, or you have a question set. And a question set is where you've got you've got these 5 questions you might ask, or these 5, and each one really covers the same thing. And if they were done right, you've established that they were normative in that it doesn't matter which question you ask, you're going to be getting at the same thing, and that one question is interchangeable for another. It isn't, I mean, so you might have 5 questions, and each 5 might be asking a different thing. You know, 1 might be about your decision making, and 2 might be about how you handle ambiguity, and a third one might be how you handle difficulty with teams. So that might be questions 1, 2, and 3. Well, you'd have another question set of questions 1, 2, and 3 that each one of those questions would cover those same things, but they would ask it a little bit differently. So you could interchange them across things like how you handle, you know, disagreements within teams, that sort of thing. So hopefully that makes sense. So question or a question set is predetermined. All right, if I could get my PowerPoint working again here, sorry about that. The other thing on a structured interview is that the questions aren't necessarily targeted for the exact job. They're usually targeted for what are the dimensions, what are the, you know, what are the knowledge, what's the knowledge, what's the skills that would be appropriate for this job, and the question set would be trying to get at that. And so you could have a set of questions that the HR department or an outside consultant would have approved for, say, job families or multiple job types. So you don't have necessarily, if you're an organization and you have, you know, 200 different types of jobs in a big organization, I mean, you really don't want 200 different interview question sets. It becomes just intractable to try to make sure they are all good and to keep them up with changes. So you typically have, as part of job analysis, you know, things like the KSAOs that are relevant to this job, and so that you would then pick from the approved question set the things that get at those KSAOs, for instance. And you might have some specific things that you would also ask that are more job specific, that are getting at making sure that the skills are really narrow and narrowly defined enough to be relevant. So, like if you're hiring a software developer position, you might have some questions that are aimed at getting at how deep is their knowledge. But for the most part, with a structured interview, you have a question set that's getting at broader things, and then you usually rely on proof of the experience. You know, convince me that the experience that's on your resume, where you were a software developer at another job, truly reflects your skill level. And then if I'm convinced of that, then I want to ask you these other questions that really get more at, like, how well do you work with teams, and how do you behave under stress, and those sorts of things. So one of the things on a structured interview is responses are typically scored. You typically write down to some extent what the candidate said in response to the particular question. And if it's a question about how well you make decisions, you would typically write down some rough summary of what they said, and then there would be often even a numerical score. Like you might have a 1 to 5. I mean, each companies are different, but like a 1 to 5 is a common thing. And then each question might have a score, and when you're done, you sort of have a total score. And then sometimes even the order of the questions is structured. They don't have to be, but often they are. And if you have a ordered set of questions, like say maybe the first one is how well you work with teams, and another one is how you deal with change, and another one is how you work alone. If those are deemed relevant per the job analysis to this particular job, you'd typically then ask that same order to all of the candidates. And that doing a structured interview should be obvious compared to an unstructured interview is less variable, it's more consistent, and it's more fair. It's also higher in reliability and validity. By its definition, an unstructured interview is all over the map. You might find one particular person who performed one that turned out to be valid, but you couldn't scale that. You couldn't actually use that for another job or for another person. So there's good reasons why you do structured interviews. To some extent, depending upon how well they are architected and how well they are mapped to the job analysis, to make sure you're asking questions that get at what it is the kind of candidate you're looking for, they can be as valid as a cognitive ability test in terms of predicting success, and that's a big deal. But devil's in the details on that one. So there's a lot of work involved in putting together a really good structured interview that includes really understanding how it would map to the job analysis, which means the job analysis also is very important. So it's a lot more work you got to put together to get a good structured interview so that it's valid and reliable, where a cognitive test is something you can, to some extent, import. All right, so one of the things about structured interviews is, and I can tell you from firsthand, from the first time I ended up having structured interviews imposed upon me by my employer, that I was like, really, you're going to tell me what questions to ask? I've been interviewing for years. I know what candidates I'm looking for. I don't need you to tell me what questions to ask. I mean, that was my response. And this, I don't know, this is not quite 20 years ago, but and that sometimes is a common response, that you're taking agency away from the interviewer. And one of the ways that what might come from that is the interviewer may just decide to do the questions they're told to ask, write down some answers, and wait on the score, and then ask their own questions and not document them, and then make sure the scores are appropriately mapped to what they really think of this person based on their questions. And that's then introducing an unstructured element to the structured interview, and you won't find a human resources person that will say that's a good idea, because again, highly variable. I'm not saying there aren't humans that know their area, know people really, really well, that if they introduce their own questions, that they could be really good questions. And but again, that would be highly, highly variable, and you wouldn't find a large, mature organization that would encourage that, but it does happen. All right. So another type of formal interview that you can sort of call it a structured interview, because it is architected and structured, but generally these are called situational or behavioral interviews. And they're a specific type of formal interview. And you're asking predetermined questions again, or a question set. And again, these are mapped to job analysis. But here you're getting, instead of it being a little bit more openly defined in its structure, here you're narrowing your structure of your interview to trying to get to behaviors, often by talking to the candidate in a situational, either hypothetical or based on their past experience, framework. So you're looking in at behaviors, or you're looking for finding a pattern of behavior to show that, hey, this person behaves in a way that would fit really well for this position in our organization, or this person doesn't. And another way of doing that is to be focusing it on specific incidents, or carefully crafted situations that might be hypothetical, or they might be real, but that you're then looking at what they say they would respond to them, or if they're bringing up something from the past experience, how they did respond. They're sort of the same thing. You're really trying to get at how does this person behave in the job under different situations, and this is a common interview type used by a lot of organizations now. It has a lot of proponents. I'm very familiar with with this type of interview, and I've had enough time performing it to come around to liking it. Whereas the first time it was introduced to me, I was, again, like, don't tell me what questions to ask, I know what I'm doing. And now it's like I see the value in this for many reasons, and I feel it's a reasonable. Again, like I said before, interviewing is I mean, to some extent it sucks and it's super artificial, and you're not getting to the heart of the person. But a good behavioral or situational structured interview is the best I've seen for going through the process. So you're looking for behaviors that would relate to predicted job performance, and you might do this from, remember, critical incident analysis. Remember that you have subject matter experts look at specific things in the job that would indicate, that could be used to judge performance level. And then you can sort of take those incidences and turn them into situations when you're doing interviews. So you're a little less focused here on characteristics or experience. You're focused on just what would you do in this situation. So these could be a hypothetical situation, or it could be from the person's experience. One way you could do that is a hypothetical situation where you simply, as part of the interview process, say, imagine a situation where, let's say the position is, you're applying for a job as a wedding planner. And so they might say, okay, imagine you're at a situation and it is the morning of a big wedding for a big party that you've been working with for 4 months, and you find out in the morning that the baker dropped the cake. And when the baker not only dropped their cake, but when they did that, they slipped and hurt their back, and there's no way the baker can make another cake. Meanwhile, you've called the other 3 bakers in town, and nobody has any availability to make a cake. So now you're going to have your wedding, and for your clients in your hypothetical job. What do you do? So you create this incident, and you're trying to figure out what kind of judgment the person has, and by having them walk through this hypothetical situation, you get a sense for how well they might be able to handle the job. Or it could be, tell me about a time in which you were, if let's say you're applying for a wedding planner position, and prior to that, you were an event planner, but this particular wedding planner position would be a big promotion for you, but and you're being interviewed. One thing might be, tell me about a time in your experience as an event planner where at the nearly last minute something came up that could really screw stuff up, and what did you do, and how did you save the day, how did you deal with it? Or tell me about a time when one of your clients got really angry, how did you handle it? So whether it's a hypothetical or it's a real experience, you're trying to get a sense of the person. With a real experience, you're allowing the person to tap into something that actually happened. They can certainly talk more credibly, but in either case, if you have a really nervous person, you can still have them like not think really well on their feet. So you are, in that case, being able to witness how well they think on their feet. But if the position doesn't involve that, and so not everybody is a wedding planner that's going to deal with last minute issues. I mean, you might be interviewing somebody that you don't really care about, short-term high stress situations with how well they might answer a question. And so you got to think about it a little bit, and then maybe the imaginary question is better then, but because you don't have the added problem of the candidate trying to think of a good example. So I've been on I've been on the interviewer side of this quite a bit, where where I've said, tell me about a time when, and then it might be, say, you had to influence without authority, which is when you're trying to get a person or a group to do what you want, but you don't have direct authority over them. Or it might be, okay, tell me about a time in which you had to institute a change that the person or people that you were imposing this change on didn't like it. What was the situation, and what did you do, and what were the results? So that's a real example. And it's how it's interpersonal. You're asking about, and how you can sort of push back. When someone gives you pushback, how do you deal with it? How do you advocate? Anyway, one of the upside of that should be fairly obvious with what I just said, because you give people an opportunity to tell about a real experience they had. The downside that I've seen multiple times is you immediately then filter out your candidates between people that are comfortable enough in the really artificial interview situation, and that's all weighed in by how badly they need the job, and whether they like meeting new people, and even like, did they get a good night's sleep last night? So how well they can think on their feet to come up with a good answer. So I've had lots of candidates over the years where I just know, since I ask a sort of question, that they're doing this. Okay, what's a good one? What's a good one? And then okay, there was a time when, and then they'll come up with something, and I have no idea if that's a great example. And I bet you when those people are driving home, they'll be like, "Damn, I should have said this one. That's a great one because that showed this and that." So you don't necessarily see the whole picture of who you're interviewing unless they're really good at thinking on their feet, and really confident in the situation, which may or may not be something you really need to care about, depending upon what the job is. Okay. So, because it is a structured, formal interview, you're going to be capturing those responses, and there'll be typically a scoring system that aggregates to a total score. One of the things about this type of interview is, you don't just take somebody who's never done interviewing in this way and just say, oh, by the way, here's a list of 5 questions that you're supposed to ask. Because if it's a behavioral situational interview process, you need to know how to tee up the positions. You need to know how to sort of solicit the right responses so that people hopefully can be relaxed and to think of good examples. You need to know when is it okay to encourage, and you also need to know don't give them the answers. And why? Why do you want this to be structured as a behavioral situational interview? What's the benefit of it, so that the people doing the interviewing are bought into it, and they don't just put quick answers down and then just ask them their unstructured questions. So there's a training burden to this, and it's not trivial. This can be a full day. It can be even three days or more that you want to take your people that are going to do interviews through. And so you'll often have outside trainers come in to do this. And that costs your organization money. And then because most organizations are moving towards panel interviews, because panel interviews, couple of things with panel interviews is the first is it's a wisdom of the crowd effect. You mitigate to some extent the impact of all the biases that people carry, of the kind of people they like and the schools they went to, and it's literally endless, the way people can develop good and positive and negative associations with things that will color to some extent how they see a situation and therefore a person. And so when you have 3 or 4 people doing the interviewing, you tend to get a situation where everybody brings their biases, but collectively there's less bias. So you have a kind of wisdom of a crowd effect if it's done right. And then the other thing you're also doing is you're developing a stronger case that you were objective and that you were fair and you were not discriminatory. And so if somebody wants to sue you because they didn't get the job, and sometimes these jobs are also internal. Sometimes you interview for a promotion if that promotion is a job isn't your current job where they're just going to pay you more and give you a fancier title. It might be where you're actually applying internally to a new position or a newly opened a position that recently reopened because the person that was in it left or themselves got promoted. You might be fighting, so to speak, competing with other internal candidates. And if you don't get the job and you consider suing because you're convinced it's because of some characteristic of yours, if it was a panel interview, your case is going to be that much more difficult. And one of the other things that big corporations, which are often are big targets for people wanting to sue, is if you have a good system in place. And it's very public that it doesn't take a whole lot of work to know that this particular corporation does behavioral situation interviews, and they do them with panels. If you go to a lawyer and say, I think I didn't get hired because I believe they were discriminating against me because of this or that reason, and the lawyer looks and says, well, they do situational behavioral interviews, they document everything, they do it with a panel, boy, this is going to be a tough case. And so you're actually, not only do you strengthen your defense in the event that you're sued, probably more importantly, is you establish a level of defense that keeps you from being sued at all, which is the bigger win. Because once you've been sued, everybody loses, because the cost of defending yourself and winning can still be, especially if it happens again and again, can be very prohibitive. So there's a lot of reasons why you want to document. It's also one of the reasons why you want to have training to make sure people are doing them right. Okay, so obviously, compared to unstructured interviews, these are higher in reliability and validity. And as I said, a nervous candidate, they can't always think of a time when they had to influence without authority, and they can hem and haw, and then some people ruminate, and they start thinking, oh no, I'm not thinking of the right thing, and I'm screwing up this whole interview. And so that's an opportunity for the interviewer, unless again they're looking for somebody that can handle that kind of pressure. If they're not, that's a time when the interviewer can actually help calm your interviewee down and get them to relax a little bit. Okay, there's some other interview types that might be used in conjunction or in lieu of. So there's like an in-basket technique, and it's kind of an old term back in the paper days when you'd have an in-basket and out-basket, and almost everything you did involved some sort of doing things to documents. Nowadays your inbox in Outlook or your inbox in email is named after the fact that there used to be an inbox that your paperwork you need to deal with would come in. So you can actually create an interview set where you sort of have real work issues and you have the candidate work them through. So that's kind of like directly assessing skills. If you have, here's a spreadsheet and you need to calculate these things, here, go do it. So this is more like a practical test, and the candidate might do it, or you might actually do it in a hypothetical manner, saying, here's what's in your inbox. How do you deal with it? And then you listen to how they respond to it. Another thing that happens rarely, but can happen, is you might have a whole bunch of candidates, and then you actually give them a problem to solve, and you actually watch all the candidates. And you're trying to figure out, because therefore you get some multidimensional things going on. I mean, you're seeing how people are interacting, and you're seeing people's leadership skills, and you're seeing people's problem solving skills, and you're seeing it isn't just about who takes charge and it's who is really the most effective, depending on what kind of job you're looking for. And then sometimes you might have a lot of candidates for something, but you you want to line them up with what they're good at. So you might assess them for their preferences, and you use that to then take them to the next level. That there might be interviews after that for specific positions, but you might have sort of a first line interview where you just get to know them a little bit and what they're good at and what they're interested in, to line them up with more specific jobs. And then there's things like called assessment centers, where you might have people come and it's a simulated job environment. It's something that was developed by the German army. Come here, put down and get down, sit on this station and do this thing, and we're going to see how well you do it. And that can actually be valid for things like you have people do it as a group. You can find teamwork and leadership and communication. But it's also been criticized when you're looking at those things. When you're looking at the interpersonal side, is the people that are more assertive often are advantaged by that structure, and so your certain people look better just because of the contrived way you did the situation. Okay, there are some other selection factors we'll go through here. Besides an interview, obviously they're at least the old school days, and this still happens at least to some extent, is you have a resume, you have a cover letter, you have letters of recommendation. Different types of jobs pay more attention to these things. If you're going for certain like academic posts or like a postdoc position because you want to be an academic, a really good letter of recommendation from your advisor or somebody esteemed in the field can be a big deal. And people can spend a lot of time on their resume, and sometimes people will spend a whole bunch of time on the format of the resume, and then they apply for the job and they find out that everything's online, and they actually have to enter all the stuff from their resume into fields, and all the work they did to format it and make it look good is gone because you can't actually submit the document. But other cases, that's still part of it. Back in the old days, you'd get a letter. And so people would pick the parchment of their resume, and you'd spend a lot of money to get that resume just printed exactly right. And a lot of that aesthetic stuff, which was sort of meant to be like a proxy for how well you handled detail, like having a misspelling on a cover letter was one easiest way to say no. And there's a certain level of informality that has bled into the way things are often done now, where these things carry less weight, but nonetheless, at least for a lot of positions, in some positions they still do. Now, one of the downsides, and the reason why they've lost a lot of the weight that they used to carry, is they're not real. The resume is real if it lists your real experience, but cover letters. If you can't write, you can usually find somebody that can write, and that wants to help you and makes a really good cover letter. And if you have a really crappy cover letter, that's okay. Not only can't you write, but you can't find anybody that can write. So I guess it'd still be valid at that level. But if you see a well-written cover letter, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was for sure written by them. And then letters of recommendation. You usually can find somebody that is in your corner that wants to write a letter of recommendation. So you often end up with a lot of flattering languages. A lot of times it's unrealistic, and overall it paints a false picture. But there's other things where certain jobs, certain skills allow for portfolios. Like if you're a particular type of software developer or engineer, you may have participated in, say, like open source software development, where you actually have your record out there and you can actually show stuff that you did. Like if you're a graphic artist, you can actually have a portfolio that shows the art that you actually created. And now you've got things like LinkedIn, where you can get other people to endorse your skills. So there, in sort of the architecting of a profile online and the personal brand stuff that's emerging allows for a new, interesting way in which you can showcase what your capabilities are, that can, in some cases, stand for themselves, and in some cases are more legitimate than the contrivance of an interview. This is an interesting evolution place where if this grows, this could supplant a lot of the artificial ways in which selection was done, and where everybody has a kind of profile and has endorsements, so to speak, from people around their KSAOs. So if GitHub is another place using the software example. These are like repositories that you can actually do work and then put it out in the world for other people to take. And like how well it's taken up and used can be an example of how useful it was. And so having things that can be viewed by others and to some extent judged based on how well they're used is a powerful tool. And then of course you have references that are internal. That's so if you work at a company and you're thinking about a candidate, and then that candidate says, I know so and so that works at your place. And you think, you know Susan? Oh, well, I know Susan. Okay. So you go talk to Susan, and Susan says, yeah, that guy. Yeah, he was in my senior design project in college, and yeah, he was really unreliable, and most people had to fix his work, and so you're like, oh, okay. Or you talk to Susan, and Susan says, "Oh, he's fantastic. He saved our bacon. I don't know how many times when we were working on senior design, and he's just great working for as a team. He's big into details. He's very punctual. Those kinds of things where you're getting a reference, but you're not getting a reference from just some person you've never met. You're not getting a letter of recommendation from someone that likes this person. You're actually getting a recommendation, a positive reference from someone you know and trust that's part of your organization. Somebody that actually has something to lose if they give you, if they blow a lot of smoke. And they just say nice things because they want to help this person, and this person you hire, it turns out to be a dud. And now you come back to Susan and say, what the heck, Susan? So there's a lot of weight. Typically, a lot of weight is given to internal references. And so that's kind of if you know somebody, you can get in kind of thing. And that's sort of true, but keep in mind, a lot of times you don't get in because you know somebody. And I've certainly seen that where you have a candidate on paper looks pretty good, and they might interview well, and then they know some people at the place you work at, and you talk to them, and they're like, yeah, that person is just totally full of bullshit. And is always taking credit for stuff that they didn't work on. And so then you see the resume and you see some of those answers in a new light. So those are powerful things because they're a little bit more credible sources. So trusted source is more highly weighted. There's other tangible work products. Anything that you can show, this was my work, or accomplishments that are recognized. You were elected to be on a board of something, or you won a competition, of a technical or a skill-related nature. Otherwise were externally recognized. Those are credible things. Okay, let's briefly go through a typical selection process. This is pretty straightforward and be real quick. So typically you've got a candidate after you've posted a job. So you've posted a job, you're looking for a person that can do X and Y. There's usually a screening process by which the candidates that are maybe desperate for a job and willing to just apply to anything out of hope, but they just don't have the experience. So you have some sort of first pass filter, often done by the HR department, sometimes even done through a computer program. Right? So in some cases, the first pass can be automated just to make sure you have had X years of experience and you have these credentials or whatever. And then you find the qualified candidates that get through that. And then the hiring manager reviews those to select what they feel is the most qualified candidates for interviews, and then the interviews happen. And then when all the interviews are done with all of the candidates that were deemed most qualified, all the people that did the interviewing, and it's often now a panel, and often that panel includes somebody from human resources. They convene and they compare the scores. They usually look for some consensus. Now, some organizations it could be the hiring manager's decision. In other organizations, they might actually intentionally take that direct power away from the hiring manager to insist that it be consensus. Again, just to improve wisdom of the crowd and to make the whole process more fair. And then once that one candidate is selected, usually human resources, possibly the hiring manager, will check the references, and those references are more along the lines of, did they work where they say they worked at, and they might have references that talk favorably about them, previous coworkers or whatever, and again, those are often discounted, but you do check to make sure that if they said they worked somewhere for a certain number of years, employers will usually share that information to make sure they didn't. You're looking for somebody that maybe lied at this last minute before you make an offer, and if it passes that final filter, an offer is made. All right, so how do you be a great interviewee? Be prepared. So ask HR where you're applying. What kind of, is this a situational behavioral interview? Is it structured in a different way? Is it a series of questions? How do we do it? There's nothing wrong with asking that. In fact, it'll usually be well received by HR if you're asking that. And then think about knowing how the interview is going to go. You sort of make a hypothetical version and practice. And especially if it's a situational behavioral one, think about like making good decisions, working with teams, dealing with conflict, dealing with change, influencing without authority. What are the things that they might look at? And HR might even share some of that with you. Then look through your work history and work relevant history. It doesn't have to be stuff at a job. And come up with a listing of situations and have those in your mind so that you have those situations to go to if you're asked those questions, so you don't do the deer in the headlights thing of, oh, well, I can't think of a good and then kick yourself because you didn't think of a great one. So have that listing of situations in your head that you think are interesting situations that had a lot of problems with it, had a lot of people, a lot of stuff that maybe you could mine for good examples. And in most cases, don't be afraid to use the same situation for more than one question if it still is a good example of a situation that's related to that question. Don't do dumb things. Don't show up late. Don't be rude. Don't dress less than the people interviewing you. I always try to dress a little bit more, even if it's a casual place. Doesn't mean that you need to look like a slob. Really important, express interest. Express interest in the organization, express interest in the job. You're interested in this company, this organization, you're interested in this job. Not just, I need a job. Express interest in the people and let that show. And have good questions. And one of the ways you do that, besides saying, I'm interested in this, which is okay to say and mean it though, but you express that interest in questions. Ask meaningful questions about the role and about the company, and ask future-oriented questions. Bone up on your domain knowledge, in case you're asked some questions that are maybe probing about your skills, your knowledge. It'd be okay to spend your time waiting for an interview, boning up on that, and then know your strengths, know your challenges. We're willing to talk to them. And when you talk about your challenges, you say how you work around them, how you deal with them, but definitely know your strengths so you can highlight those too. And then relax, if you can. But your job, it's not gonna be on your tombstone. You're who you were from a relationship standpoint is usually the thing they talk about at your funeral. So at the end of the day, this is not the most important thing. And if you lean into that a little bit, you can relax a little bit. You don't want it to think you don't care about this, but you definitely want to be in a comfortable state. And then make sure you follow up. The handwritten thank you note is old school, but it's one of those little signs. But Don't just disappear, and because you never know when it's between you and one other person. And boy, you both interviewed great, you had great resumes, great experience. And nobody could decide. The panel scores were all the same, but hey, one person gave a written thank you note and the other one didn't even do anything. Well, okay, that was enough to get from 50-50 to 51-49. So make sure you follow up. All right, so let's recap. We're at an hour. I failed you at getting you some time back. So you're probably listening to some of this at greater than 1x. So the math actually works out for you. But I'll try to find a few future lectures. I can give you like 5 minutes back if I can. Okay, we talked about interviewing. We talked about structured and unstructured. And we talked quite a bit about the situational behavioral style. And we talked about other interview-like types, and we talked about other things you look at for making selections. And we gave an example of a selection process flow. And then we just finished talking about some high-level stuff, but really important, about how to improve your chances and be a great interviewee. All right, lecture 12 is our next bonus lecture, our fourth bonus lecture. This one should be fun. It's about individual differences at work. We'll talk about what are those differences, what are the dimensions of difference, and we'll spend quite a bit of the time talking about personality. But we'll also talk about thinking styles, cognitive styles. And we'll talk about how life experience also ends up being quite a source of difference. And we'll talk about neurodiversity. All right, hope that was good. We will see you for lecture 12.